Welcome to this explainer. If you've been looking at the stock market hitting all-time highs and thinking, okay, but why does it feel so incredibly hard to just get by right now? You're definitely not alone. Today, we're going to map out exactly how the economic pain from the 2008 financial crash didn't actually disappear, it just evolved into the really complex affordability crisis we're all living through today. Remember this? Back in 2011, "We are the 99%" became this absolutely iconic slogan. It perfectly captured this massive collective frustration that Wall Street got bailed out while everyday working families just got sold out. Today, the crisis looks a bit different on the surface, but as we'll see in the data, that underlying disconnect is surprisingly similar.
Okay, to make sense of all this, we're going to break this explainer down into a few key areas. We'll look at the echoes of 2008, the new housing squeeze, what's really happening in the labor market, the stark racial wealth divide, the compounding pressure of debt and policy, and finally, how this is basically a different crisis with the exact same underlying problem. Let's jump right in.
Starting off with Section 1, Echoes of 2008, comparing two different financial crises.
Look, you have to contrast the late 2000s with what's hitting us right now. Back in '08, it was all about toxic loans and completely collapsing home values, right? People owed way more than their houses were actually worth. But today's crisis is fundamentally about the sheer, suffocating cost of maintaining a basic standard of living. It's not about your house losing value, it's about the staggering cost to just keep the lights on and the roof insured.
Which brings us to Section 2, the new housing squeeze. We are moving from "I can't buy" to "I can't keep."
And this number right here, honestly, it's pretty shocking. According to Bankrate, the average annual hidden cost of owning and maintaining a single-family home hit more than $21,000 in 2025. That is a massive chunk of change. The squeeze has literally shifted from trying to get your foot in the door to desperately trying not to get kicked out of the house you already own.
So it forces this huge paradigm shift. Think about it. With property taxes spiking nearly 20% and homeowners insurance jumping a wild 41%, people are legitimately and understandably asking, does the classic American dream of homeownership actually make financial sense anymore? Or is renting just straight up cheaper now?
Well, Redfin's data exposes a glaring gap. To afford a median-priced home right now, you need to be pulling in about $111,000 a year. But the median household income? That's sitting at just $86,000. When you look at this, the typical household is basically way closer to qualifying for a rental, which takes about $76,000, than they are to ever buying a home. It's wild.
Let's pivot a bit to Section 3, the hidden labor crisis, because we really need to look way beyond the official unemployment rate to see what's actually going on.
You hear politicians talking about low unemployment all the time, but the official headline rate is honestly super incomplete. It completely glosses over the 6 million people who desperately want a job but aren't actively counted because they've had to stop looking, or the folks forced to work part-time just to scrape by. So when people say, hey, the economy feels way worse than the numbers say, this data right here, this is exactly why.
And it gets more intense. Challenger reported over 60,000 job cuts in March 2026 alone. Now, the crazy part? A full 25% of those cuts were directly blamed on artificial intelligence displacement. It's not some sci-fi future problem anymore, guys. It is a present-day reality that is totally upending job security as we know it.
All right, Section 4, the racial wealth divide, because structural inequality totally dictates who actually survives these economic shocks. This is where history really catches up with us. Rooted in decades of systemic disparities in housing and income, Federal Reserve data from 2022 shows something pretty stark. Despite some growth at the margins, the absolute dollar gap between white and black median wealth didn't shrink. It actually widened to more than $220,000.
To put that in perspective, the typical black family held only about 16 cents for every dollar of typical white family wealth. That's roughly a 10-to-1 gap. So why does this matter today? Well, when a massive property tax hike hits or you lose your job to AI, having only 16 cents to the dollar in relative wealth means you have almost zero cushion. It pushes families much faster into unsecured debt or worse, total financial ruin.
And that lack of a wealth cushion is being severely compounded by what we're seeing in the labor market. Just looking at 2025, the data's rough. We saw intense job losses, including 319,000 jobs lost by black women in just a few short months. Overall, the Center for Economic and Policy Research estimated a staggering 1.8 million jobs deficit for Black America. That translates to an estimated $87 billion in lost income. Just an absolutely massive hit. Adding fuel to the fire, recent federal policies are actively rolling back diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. The source data shows this directly restricts access to economic pipelines. We're talking about slashing federal contracting goals for disadvantaged businesses from 15% all the way down to 5% and cutting hundreds of millions in minority-serving grants. It's literally removing the very pipelines designed to help communities build wealth. Moving on to Section 5, Debt, Bankruptcy, and Policy. Let's look at how all these pressures compound on everyday households.
I mean, really think about the sheer combined weight of this stuff. You've got families getting slammed by inflation on groceries, sky-high interest rates, job instability from AI, and exploding housing costs, all at the exact same time. It's like a pressure cooker. When all that happens at once, swiping a credit card isn't about buying a luxury TV anymore. It becomes a literal survival mechanism just to buy groceries and keep the heat on.
And eventually, something has to give. U.S. courts reported nearly 592,000 bankruptcy filings in the 12 months ending March 2026. That's an 11.9% spike. Bankruptcy is what we call a lagging indicator, meaning it's the final alarm bell. It tells us that those compounding pressures we just talked about have completely overwhelmed hundreds of thousands of families. Of course, we can't let government policy off the hook here. Policy choices directly dictate how much it costs just to survive every single day. Tariffs, for example, added 3.1% to the prices of core goods by jacking up import costs. Meanwhile, restrictions on things like SNAP and Medicaid are forcing families to pull even more money out of their already empty pockets for basic food and healthcare. This brings us to our final part, Section 6. Different crisis, same problem. We're looking at the evolving divide between asset owners and wage earners. When we map the anxieties of the 2008 Occupy Wall Street era directly onto today, the through line is practically impossible to ignore. The core structural divide was never actually resolved. It just mutated, right? It went from outrage over risky banking bailouts to this modern nightmare of widespread unaffordability, AI taking jobs, and a structural wealth gap that just keeps getting wider and wider. So, the overarching takeaway from all this data is basically this. Top-level economic growth, record stock market highs, and quote-unquote low unemployment, none of that means a thing to you if you are drowning in rising insurance premiums just to keep your house, or maxing out credit cards to cover your utility bills. Which leaves us with a pretty massive question for the future. As our economy keeps evolving, if we don't bridge these deeply ingrained systemic disparities, from that glaring racial wealth gap to basic housing affordability, who is actually going to be able to afford to live in the economy of tomorrow? Something to really think about. Thanks for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning the data, and we will see you next time.